French campaign in Egypt and Syria is Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign to protect French trade, undermine Britain's access to India, and promote scientific enterprise in the region. An unusual aspect of the Egyptian military expedition is the inclusion of a large group of scientists and scholars. This deployment of intellectual resources is an indication of Napoleon's devotion to higher learning. Much of what we know today about ancient Egypt is the result of this mission. Discoveries include the deciphering of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics by way of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was etched in hieroglyphics in Greek. The known Greek figures allowed the French to decipher the unknown Egyptian and translate into modern languages. John Robison was a prominent physicist and professor of philosophy at Scotland's Edinburgh University. He worked with James Watt on the early steam car, and he later invented the siren. The Illuminati had attempted to recruit him, but he declined. In 1798 he writes Proof of a Conspiracy Against the Religions and Governments of Europe, in which he exposes the secret societies behind the terrorist French Revolution. His warning to Europe is stark. An association has been formed for the express purpose of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning all existing governments. The leaders would rule the world with uncontrollable power, while all the rest would be employed as tools of their unknown superiors. Robison also described the delicate process by which powerful men and idealistic intellectuals were sucked into Weinsamp's global scheme. Weinsamp had long been scheming the establishment of an association or order which in time should govern the world. These new recruits are managed with delicacy and circumspection that the timid may not be alarmed. In like manner, political doctrines of the order are inculcated with utmost caution. After the mind of the pupil has been warmed by the pictures of universal happiness and convinced that it is a possible thing to unite all the inhabitants of the earth in one great society, and after it has been made out in some measure to the satisfaction of the pupil that a great addition of happiness is gained by the abolition of national distinctions and animosities, it may frequently be no hard task to make him think that patriotism is narrow-minded, monopolizing sentiment, and even incompatible with the more enlarged views of the order, namely the uniting of the whole human race into one great happy society. French priest Abbé Barrault independently developed similar views that the Illuminati had infiltrated Freemasonry, leading to the excesses of the French Revolution. In 1798, the Reverend G.W. Snyder sent Robinson's book to George Washington for his thoughts on the subject. Washington replied, "It was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati and principles of Jacobism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more truly satisfied of this fact than I am. The idea that I meant to convey was that I did not believe that the lodges of Freemasons in this country had as societies endeavoured to propagate the diabolical tenets of the first or pernicious principles of the latter, if they are susceptible of separation." Robinson was a big man of science and letters. George Washington agreed with his observation about the Illuminati and the Jacobin infiltration of Freemasonry. After amassing an enormous fortune from his base in the Hessian city of Frankfurt, Germany, Mayor Amschel Rothschild sent his 5 sons abroad to expand the Rothschild family empire throughout Europe. Each of the brothers would emerge as dominant financial players and behind-the-scenes political players in their respective new countries. The five sons and their five sub-dynasties they will operate are as follows. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt to run the German operation. Salomon went to Vienna in Austria. Nathan originally went to Manchester and then London in England. Carl went to Naples in Italy. And Jacob went to Paris in France. Of the five, Nathan in London, the city of London, will become the wealthiest and most powerful of all the brothers. His power surpasses even that of other existing Jewish family dynasties that own the Bank of England, the Montefiore's, the Goldschmidts, and the Mercators. The London branch of the Rothschilds was, and still is, the beating heart of the centuries-old movement to tear down European civilization and erect the New World Order in its place. The Jewish-produced 1934 Hollywood film The House of Rothschild made no effort to hide the historical power of the five sons, especially Nathan of London. The film also portrays the buying up of the London market, but it makes it seem like it was an accidental consequence of trying to save the market and not insider trading. The immense wealth of the Rothschild family still commands obedience. This is Sir Evelyn de Rothschild with gold bars, also commenting on the BBC News. Unhappy with the expansion of the French Empire, won by France after the previous war imposed upon it, Britain, Austria and Russia initiate the next round of war. Napoleon is away in Egypt at this time. The Allies are very successful and poised not only to control Italy, but to thrust into southern France itself. Britain's King George III had failed to put down the American Revolution. Now he is obsessed with bringing Republican France under control. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct objective the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." Napoleon and his allies in Paris are convinced that a change of regime, strengthening the executive power, is necessary. Napoleon, who feels he is fighting a series of fruitless wars in Egypt, is persuaded that only he could save France. The war hero of Toulon, Italy, and Egypt returns to a deeply divided and chaotic Paris as the country itself faces an Allied invasion. With the help of key French senators, Napoleon stages a bloodless coup and is named first consul. Plebiscite, popular vote, is held soon after, and Napoleon's ascension to the first consul is overwhelmingly approved by the French public. The New World Order gang incited the French Revolution in order to overthrow the monarchy. Now, with the rapid rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the New World Order has lost control of France. Immediately after seizing power in France, Napoleon offers to make peace with the coalition arrayed against him. Britain and Austria reject his offer. So in 1800, Napoleon does the unexpected. He restages Hannibal's crossing of the Alps and then marches his army through the snowy Great St. Bernard Pass to attack Austrian forces based in Italy. Napoleon defeats the surprised Austrians at the Battle of Marengo on the 14th of June 1800. Following Marengo, the massive Battle of Hohenlinden forces the Austrians to the negotiating table. As a result, Austrian Emperor Francis II signs the Treaty of Lunenville in February 1801. France will retain all of its previous gains and obtain new lands in Tuscany, Italy, while Austria is granted Venetia and the Dalmatian coast. And so, in just a matter of months, under the decisive political, military leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, a French disaster became a French triumph. Meanwhile, Britain remains at war with France. The communistic Jacobins, working for their secret New World Order Rothschild bosses in London, want their bloody dictatorship back. They openly called for the death of Napoleon. One leftist agitator named Mech publishes a pamphlet comparing Napoleon to Roman ruler Julius Caesar, who was killed by daggers wielded by Brutus and others. Mech openly calls for the birth of thousands of Bruti to stab the tyrant Bonaparte. Indeed, one of the Jacobin plots which is foiled, the conspiration de Poignard, conspiracy of the daggers, in October 1800, Jacobins planned to stab Napoleon, as Julius Caesar had been. He arrives at the Paris Opera House. Informants are able to foil the assassination plot, but the Jacobins will try again to kill Napoleon. Two months after the dagger plot is foiled, the Jacobins nearly succeed in blowing up Napoleon's carriage with a bomb. The plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, or Infernal Machine. Napoleon and Josephine both survived the massive blast. A dozen or so innocent bystanders are killed, with dozens more injured or maimed. Modern-day liberal historians, apologists for the Jacobins, claim that Bourbon royalists were behind the plot, but Napoleon is convinced that his Jacobin enemies carried out the attack. He uses public outrage over the bombing to annihilate the remnants of the violent and conspiratorial Red Jacobins. Napoleon declared, "For such an atrocious crime, we must have vengeance, like a thunderbolt. Blood must flow. We must shoot as many guilty men as there have been victims." After years of persecution at the hands of atheistic Jacobin radicals and also the Directory, Napoleon moves to protect and preserve the Roman Catholic Church that he had spared from extinction during his Italian campaign. Raised Catholic himself, Napoleon is a deist who retains a special fondness for the moral principles and ceremonies of the Church. Napoleon is also impressed by Islam and believes that people of all faiths should have freedom of conscience. The Concordat of 1801 between Napoleon Bonaparte and Pope Pius VII reaffirms the Catholic Church as the majority church of France and restores its civil status. While the Concordat restores ties to the papacy, the balance of church-state relations tilts in Napoleon's favour. The Concordat reassured French Catholics, angered Red atheists, and improved relations with the Vatican. Education is very high on Napoleon's list of priorities, especially that of the middle class. He believes in a system of merit, and for such a system to be effective, there must be widespread education at the secondary level. To that end, Napoleon establishes the system of lycée. Lycée is an upper-level secondary school prepping students for the baccalaureate. The baccalaureate is a degree required for university admission. Lycées enroll the nation's best students in a course of instruction lasting 6 years. The schools are divided into 3 areas of specialisation: classical studies, modern studies, and scientific technological studies. Under the system, elementary schools are to be the responsibility of the local municipalities. Catholic schools take on a significant amount of the load for mass elementary education. Secondary education, however, is the base education for the future leaders of France, as well as the members of the bureaucracy and the military. At the heart of the new system is the establishment of 30 lycées, which provide educational opportunities beyond the secondary schools. The government provides a fixed salary for teachers, but also pays out bonuses for successful teachers. Top-notch teachers are chosen based upon their recommendations provided by inspectors. The inspectors are also given the responsibility for inspecting the schools on a regular basis. The education system, introduced by Napoleon, has 2 purposes. It is intended to provide educated elite that can help run the country and the military, and it is also designed to provide for an increased middle class, one that would be successful and hence non-revolutionary. There is also great emphasis on patriotism within the schools. At a meeting in 1807, Napoleon declared, "Of all of our institutions, public education is the most important. Everything depends upon it, present and the future. It is essential that the morals and political ideas of the generation which is now growing up should no longer be dependent upon the news of the day or circumstances of the moment. Above all, we must secure unity. We must be able to cast a whole generation in the same mould." Napoleon's merit-based system of pre-university lycées opened up the doors to higher education for middle and lower classes. The system is partially in effect to this day. The Treaty of Amiens ends hostilities between the French Republic and Great Britain. It is signed in the city of Amiens on the 25th of March 1802 and is celebrated as the definitive treaty of peace between Napoleon and Britain. In retrospect, it appears to have been a British ploy to buy time and assemble yet another coalition. The Peace of Amiens lasts only a year and is the only period of extended peace during the Great French War between 1793 and 1815. Britain, under the leadership of King George III and Prime Minister William Pitt, does not evacuate Malta as promised. Instead, the British protest against Bonaparte's annexation of Piedmont and his act of mediation, which establishes a new Swiss Confederation, though neither of these territories are covered by the treaty. These phony pretexts for starting a new war against Napoleon culminate in a declaration of war by Britain in 1803, and the reassembly of yet another coalition against France in 1805. Britain, Russia, Naples, Sicily, Sweden. Having failed to kill Napoleon from within France itself, the New World Order mafia and the royal families of Europe will continue to wage these bloody coalition wars on post-revolutionary France. It is important to note that without Rothschild funding, the future coalition wars will not be possible, at least not in the long term. The British-led Old World Order, unenlightened monarchies, and the New World Order, Rothschild's Illuminati Jacobins, both seek the demise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars were all led by Britain, and the later ones were largely funded by Rothschilds. The warmongering Prime Minister William Pitt really was the Churchill of his day. Napoleon Bonaparte needed money to finance France's war of self-defense against the British-led European powers, but he was unwilling to borrow from the big bankers. Napoleon did borrow some money, but he also utilized other means for finance. Instead of crawling to Rothschild and friends who were heavily funding the British, Prussians and the Austrians, he raised money by proposing to sell the massive territory of Louisiana to the United States. Napoleon's move would also close a possible front in the Western Hemisphere from which Britain could wage war against the French territory. President Thomas Jefferson jumped at the offer. The Jefferson-Napoleon deal doubled America's territory and hindered, but not eliminated, Britain's ability to incite hostile Indians against the American settlers. In an 1803 letter to Andrew Jackson, who had served in the US Senate while Jefferson was Vice President of the United States, President of the Senate, Jefferson explained how the deal would benefit America's future and stop European powers from using Indians to harass American settlers. An excerpt from the letter reads as follows: "The acquisition of Louisiana is of immense importance to our future tranquility, insomuch as it removes the intrigues of foreign nations to a distance from which they can no longer produce disturbance between the Indians and us. It will also open an asylum for these unhappy people in a country which may suit their habits of life better than what they now occupy, which perhaps they will be willing to exchange with us. And to our posterity, it opens a noble prospect of provision for the ages. The world will here see such an extent of country under a free and moderate government as it has never yet seen. The importance of this expansion will come into play when we get into the War of 1812, which will make Andrew Jackson a national hero." For the rest of this chapter, we will look at the future President Andrew Jackson's early years. Scottish-Irish colonists Andrew and Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson and their two toddler sons Hugh and Robert arrived at the American colonies from present-day Northern Ireland in 1765. They settled in the Waxhaw border region between North and South Carolina. The Scots, Irish, some of whom, like Jackson, had red hair, were very family and clan orientated, and never afraid of a fight. Andrew Jackson was born on March the 15th, 1767, just 3 weeks after his father died in a logging accident while clearing land. Baby Jackson and his mother and his brothers then moved in with the Jackson's aunt and uncle, who also lived in the remote region. When Jackson grew into a boy, he was schooled by two nearby priests. From Generals Andrew Jackson to Ulysses Grant, Stonewall Jackson to George Patton and Douglas MacArthur, the Scotch-Irish were born fighters with a bold spirit and a love for liberty that shaped America. During the American Revolutionary War, Jackson's eldest brother, Hugh, 16, died from heat exhaustion after the Battle of Stono Ferry on the 20th of June, 1779. During that battle, the feisty southern rebels held their own against the British forces. In 1780, anti-British sentiment intensified following the aftermath of the Battle of the Waxhaws, after the British were alleged to have massacred surrendering Americans. Accounts of the event seem inconclusive, but the massacre became the focus of an intense propaganda campaign by the American Continental Army to bolster recruitment and incite hatred against the British. During this time, Andrew, 13, and his slightly elder brother Robert began to help the militia as couriers. The Jackson brothers were captured by the British in 1781. While in captivity, there was an incident in which young Andrew refused to clean the boots of a British officer. The imperious officer slashed Jackson with a sword, leaving him with scars in his left hand and his head, as well as even a deeper hatred for the British. Robert Jackson also refused to take orders from the British and was struck with a sword as well. Held in horrible conditions, the Jacksons eventually contracted smallpox and nearly starved to death in captivity. Elizabeth Jackson finally managed to secure her son's release and walked with her sickly boys back to their home, its distance of about 40 miles. Robert, who was in a worse condition, rode on the only horse while Andrew walked behind them. In the final hours of the journey, a torrential downpour started, worsening the effects of the smallpox. Robert died a few days later, and Andrew almost died as well. After nursing Andrew back to health, Elizabeth volunteered to care for American prisoners of war on board the two British ships docked at Charleston Harbour, where there had been an outbreak of cholera. In November of 1781, Mama Jackson died from the disease, leaving Andrew an orphan with no siblings at age 14. He blamed the British personally for the loss of his two older brothers and his mother. After the American colonies had gained their independence from Great Britain, Jackson boarded with several different people while studying in a local Waxhaw school. He had to grow up fast. Jackson worked as a saddle maker and later on as a school teacher. In 1784, he moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, where he studied law under an attorney named Spruce McKay, who had taken a liking to the 17-year-old. Jackson eventually learned enough to gain admission to the North Carolina bar in 1787. Not long afterwards, Jackson obtained a prosecutor position in the Western District of North Carolina, later to become the state of Tennessee. It's interesting to note that a qualified candidate did not need a college nor a law school degree to take an exam and become a lawyer back then. In the 1790s, Tennessee, not yet a state, would have been considered the wild southwestern frontier. Waite Avery was regarded as the most prominent man and leading lawyer of Western North Carolina. He was educated at Princeton, which was known as the College of New Jersey during those days, and he served as a colonel during the Revolution. He had a most extensive legal practice in the region. In 1788, Avery, who was 47, and Jackson, who was 21, were the opposing attorneys in a case which Jackson grew increasingly frustrated by Avery's reliance on the authority of Bacon's abridgment. It was a legal volume which Avery kept in his saddlebag at all times. His custom was to pull out the book during court arguments and declare, referring to Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon was an English philosopher and a statesman of the 16th century. Avery took great offence over Jackson's ridiculing of his obsession with Bacon. The senior attorney talked down to young Jackson in the courtroom, accusing him of not knowing anything about the law. Jackson grew incensed. He ripped a blank page out of a law book and wrote a note challenging Avery to a duel. During the negotiations that preceded duels in those days, the parties usually called off and worked out an honourable arrangement. The duel ended with both men deliberately missing their shots, which was usual for most duels. They actually became friends afterwards. According to Avery family lore, Jackson had not only mocked Avery's obsession with bacon, but had managed to replace the bacon's abridgment, which was in Avery's bag, with an actual slab of bacon. According to another version of events, after the duel had ended amicably, Jackson presented Avery with a package, joking with him, "Colonel Avery, I knew that if I had hit you and not killed you immediately, the greatest comfort to you in your final moments would be to have a copy of Bacon's abridgment near you." As Avery opened the package, a large piece of cured bacon fell out. The two men enjoyed a good laugh and walked off the dueling field together as good friends. As he had demonstrated as a boy during the Revolution, and now again as a young rookie attorney, Andrew Jackson was not one to tolerate gruff or disrespect from what he perceived as unjust authority, be it that of arrogant British officers, pompous attorneys, or even that of Sir Francis Bacon. During the days of duelling for honour, many duels were settled in advance through intermediaries referred to as seconds, with agreements being made that shots would be deliberately missed. Bored and looking for new opportunities, Jackson moved to what was then the small frontier town of Nashville, where he lived as a boarder at the home of a widow named Rachel Stockley Donaldson. It was here that Jackson became acquainted with the widow's daughter, Rachel Donaldson Roberts. At the time, young Rachel was in an unhappy and abusive marriage with Captain Lewis Robards. The Robards had then separated in 1790. After hearing that Robards had obtained a divorce, Jackson courted and, with permission from Rachel's mother, married Rachel. However, unknown to the Jacksons, the divorce had never been completed in the eyes of the state, technically making Rachel's marriage to Jackson bigamous and therefore invalid. We say technically because on the underdeveloped frontiers of the expanding America at that time, it was not at all uncommon for committed relationships, in essence marriages, to be formed and dissolved unofficially, just as long as they were recognised by the local community. After Robards' divorce was officially completed, Rachel and Jackson did legally marry in 1794, but the confusion over the actual dates of the Robards' divorce would later be used by Jackson's many enemies to harm Rachel's reputation in an attempt to bring down Jackson. Andrew Jackson described his wife as a being so gentle. His love for her and willingness to defend her honour inspired a book by Patricia Brady. After moving to Nashville, Jackson, through his connection with the Donaldson family, became the protege of William Blount, a signer of the US Constitution and one of the leading men in the territory. He became Attorney General in 1791 and won an election as a delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 1796. After Tennessee achieved statehood that year, he was elected its only US representative as a member of the Democratic Republican Party, which was the dominant party in Tennessee. The Democrat-Republican Party had been established by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for the purpose of opposing the Federalist Party of the New York City Central banker Alexander Hamilton. and the Hamilton drive for a stronger, larger central government. Jackson soon became associated with the more radical, anti-British, anti-central bank wing of the Democrat Republicans and criticised President George Washington, who appears to have been bamboozled by Hamilton, for removing the Democrat Republicans from public office. In 1797, the Tennessee state legislature elected him as U.S. Senator, as U.S. Senators, as stipulated by the U.S. Constitution, were appointed by states, not elected in those days. Jackson disliked the job and became disgusted with the administration of President John Adams, a Federalist. He also missed his wife because the journey to Philadelphia, which was the US capital at the time, took about 30 days on horseback. He resigned the following year. Jackson was a Jeffersonian who favoured minimal government and distrusted the Philadelphia-based central bank, which was the Bank of the United States. Upon returning home, Jackson was elected to serve as a judge of the Tennessee Supreme Court. His service as a judge earned him a reputation for honesty and wise decisions. In 1802, while still serving on the court, he declared his candidacy for the Major General Commander of the Tennessee Militia, a position voted on by the officers of the militia. At that time, most free men were members of the militia. The organizations intended to be called upon in case of conflict with Europeans or Indians also functioned as large social clubs. With strong support from Western Tennessee, Jackson tied with John Sevier, a popular Revolutionary War veteran and former governor. With 17 votes apiece, Governor Archibald Roane broke the tie in Jackson's favour after Jackson had presented Roane with evidence of massive land fraud which appeared to implicate Sevier. In 1803, when John Sevier announced his intention to again run for the governorship seat that he had previously held, incumbent Governor Roane cited the fraud which Jackson had brought to light, evidence of which Sevier had previously blocked from being released. In spite of the controversy, Sevier unseated Roane and became governor again. After his inauguration, Governor Sevier, who appears to have been a crook or at least an accomplice to fraud after the fact, insulted Jackson in public over his and Rachel Jackson's adultery, which, as we've already reviewed, was not the case given the circumstances out on the barely governed frontier at the time. This accusation against him, and more importantly his beloved Rachel, led to a physical fight in which Jackson had to be pulled away from the governor of Tennessee. The following day, he sent Sevier a letter challenging him to a duel. Because dueling in Tennessee was illegal, they picked a meeting place in Virginia to settle their feud. Jackson arrived at the agreed location first and waited several hours for the governor. After a while, believing Sevier wasn't going to show up, he started to head to Tennessee. Jackson then encountered Sevier on the road heading to the agreed location. The men exchanged insults. Jackson pulled out his gun and chased Sevier after he'd fallen off his horse. Eventually, the situation was calmed down by the seconds and the enemies parted ways. Supporters of Jackson and Sevier spent the ensuing months insulting each other in the papers, but the dispute between the governor and the commander of the militia enhanced Jackson's reputation as a fighting man of honour and garnered him much notoriety. This would not be the last time that Jackson's enemies insulted Rachel. The Jacobins are not the only ones who want Napoleon dead or removed from the scene. Royalist Bourbon conspirators such as Comte d'Artois, which is the brother of the guillotined King Louis XVI, who was funded and protected by William Pitt and his gang in Britain, want to take Napoleon out too. The foiled kidnapping plot of 1804 is one of the bolder schemes and was actually hatched back in 1803 while the Treaty of Amiens was still in effect. As he had done after the failed bomb plot of 1800, Napoleon cracks down hard as his popularity reaches even greater heights. The key plotters are executed. During his latter years of exile, Napoleon defended his controversial crackdown on the Bourbon family royalists, which were the Old World Order, and the Jacobins, which were the New World Order. He said, "Am I a dog, to be hounded down and killed in the street, while my murderers are to be regarded as sacrosanct?" He also stated, "What I did was to silence the royalists and the Jacobins once and for all." Napoleon's lasting reforms include higher education, a tax code, road systems, and sewer systems. His set of civil laws, the Code Civil, known as the Napoleonic Code, is prepared by committees of legal experts. Napoleon participates actively in the sessions of the Council of State that revises the drafts. The code forbids privileges based on birth, allows freedom in religion, and specifies that government jobs must go to the most qualified. Other codes are commissioned by Napoleon to codify criminal and commerce law. Code of Criminal Instruction is also published, which enacts rules of due process. The code will be accepted throughout much of Europe and remain in force even after Napoleon's eventual defeat. It's a revolutionary idea that spurs the development of the middle class by extending to all the right to own property. Napoleon also reorganises what had been left of the Holy Roman Empire, made up of more than 1,000 entities, into a streamlined 40-state confederation of the Rhine. This confederation will provide the basis for the German Confederation and the unification of Germany in 1871. Though technically a dictator, Napoleon uses his power to promote meritocracy, equality, under the law and liberty, not only among its French subjects, but also for the peoples living in territories conquered after winning the many coalition wars imposed upon France. The Napoleonic Code sought to eliminate undeserved privileges and establish true justice and liberty. Back in 1795, London's banker agent, Alexander Hamilton, was forced to resign his treasury position in disgrace when it was discovered that he was having an affair with another man's wife. It was the Maria Reynolds affair. He was later named in 1798, at Washington's insistence, as a senior Major General of the Continental Army by President John Adams, who actually, like so many others, hated Hamilton. The bad blood between Aaron Burr and Hamilton dated back to 1778, when Washington, who had come out of retirement to head the army for the quasi-war with France, which never materialised, turned down at Hamilton's insistence Burr's application for a Brigadier General's commission. Because of his influence in New York and the opposition to the Federalists, Hamilton and his allies dodged Burr throughout the rest of his career. Finally, in 1804, Burr, who was now Vice President to Thomas Jefferson, challenged Hamilton to a duel for what he alleged were defamatory statements made by Hamilton. The showdown took place at Weehawken Heights in New Jersey. Hamilton fired first but missed. Burr's shot rang out a few seconds later, struck Hamilton in the abdomen. He was taken to Manhattan and died hours later. Although dueling was illegal in New Jersey, Burr evaded charges and returned to Washington, D.C. to finish out the last 8 months of his term as Vice President.